She had everything a woman could want: a mansion, a name, a man who wore power like a second skin. But on the coldest night Chicago had seen in a decade, her husband opened the front door and threw her out into the snow like she was nothing. No coat, no bag, no goodbye. Just a man's contempt dressed up as justice. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was exactly who he had just thrown away. Stay until the very end, because this story will wreck you. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to know where in the world you're watching this with me tonight. Poczek. Graham Whitmore did not raise his voice when he destroyed things. That was the part people never understood about him. His cruelty arrived quietly, the way a blade enters between ribs. You felt the cold before you felt the pain. Vanessa had learned this in the first year of their marriage, though she had spent 3 more years convincing herself she had imagined it. She was not imagining it tonight. The study door was oak, 2 inches thick, and Graham had closed it behind him when he came home at 9:30. She heard his shoes on the marble, deliberate, slow, and something in her chest tightened the way it always did. That old animal instinct that knew the weather before the clouds arrived. She was sitting in the chair by the window with a book open in her lap that she had not been reading, watching the snow come down outside in thick sideways sheets. Chicago in January. The kind of cold that didn't negotiate. She heard him pause outside the door. Then it opened. Graham Whitmore at 51 was the kind of man architects might have designed if they wanted to build something impressive and hollow. 6'2", silver at the temples, jaw like something quarried rather than grown. He wore his suits the way generals wore medals. Not for warmth, but to remind the room of what he had conquered. Tonight he still had his coat on. He hadn't bothered to take it off. That told her everything. "Graham?" she said. Not a greeting. More like an acknowledgement that the storm had arrived. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking. His eyes did that thing they did when he was calculating. Not angry yet, just sorting, the way a man sorts receipts before he decides which ones to dispute. "The Meridian deal collapsed," he said. She set the book down. "I heard Reeves mention it might be anything." He walked to his desk. Not toward her, away from her, as if she were furniture he was navigating around. "It collapsed. $300 million. 14 months of work. Gone." "I'm sorry, Graham." "What happened?" He stopped with his back to her and stood there, one hand resting on the edge of the desk, and the silence in the room got heavy enough to press against her skin. "Cartwright pulled out," he said. "Called me at 6:30 this evening. Said he'd received information, documentation, that made him question the integrity of our operation." He turned then. "Documentation about our finances, our internal structure. Materials that were not supposed to exist outside of this house." Vanessa felt the cold before she understood where it was coming from. "What kind of documentation?" "Spreadsheets, communications, things that were on my private server." He said it the way men say things when they have already reached a verdict and are only narrating the sentencing. Things that only someone with access to this house could have taken. She stood up. Not from fear, or not only from fear, but because she needed the floor under her feet, and she needed to be standing when this hit her. "You think I gave Cartwright those documents? I think you gave someone those documents. Graham, don't." He said it softly. That soft voice. She had come to hate that soft voice worse than shouting. "Don't do the wide-eyed thing. Don't perform confusion for me. I've watched you in this house for 4 years. I know every expression you own." "Then you know I'm not performing anything." She kept her own voice level, which cost her something. A tightening in her throat, a pressure behind her sternum, the effort of holding herself together while a man she had loved dismantled her in a tone you'd use to discuss a leaking pipe. "I have never touched your business files. I don't even have access to us." Lydia pulled the server logs. Lydia. Of course. Lydia Cross, his executive assistant who had been in Graham's orbit for 6 years and in his blind spot for all of them, who brought him coffee, at precisely the temperature he liked it, and laughed at the right moments, and watched Vanessa across boardroom tables, with a patience that never quite looked like patience. "Lydia pulled logs," Vanessa said carefully. "And they showed what, exactly?" "Your account credentials were used to access the private server on the 14th, between 2 and 4 in the afternoon."
I was in Evanston on the 14th, the Harmon Gallery opening. Graham, there are photographs. Accounts can be accessed remotely. I don't even know the password to your... Vanessa. He said her name like a door closing. I need you to stop talking. The snow outside was picking up. She could see it through the tall windows, the way it moved sideways in the wind, not falling so much as attacking. The city lights blurred behind it, orange and distant. She thought, absurdly, about how she had loved the snow when she was a girl, had stood at windows exactly like this one and pressed her palm to the cold glass and felt the miracle of it, all that white coming down out of a dark sky, covering everything over. Graham had moved away from the desk. He was at the closet now, that large built-in along the north wall, and he was removing things from it. Not his things. Her coat. Her shoes. He took her coat, the thin camel hair one, her least warm, the one she wore in October, and held it out toward her, and it took her a full second to understand what the gesture meant. "What are you doing?" she said. Not a question. The question part had dropped out of it somewhere. "I want you out of this house tonight." The sentence landed clean and simple and absolutely final. 4 years. 4 years of cooking dinners in a kitchen where he ate alone while checking his phone. 4 years of sleeping in a bed where he maintained a distance even in unconsciousness, his body curled away from hers like she was a draft he was avoiding. 4 years of swallowing her own opinions at dinner parties, of laughing at jokes that weren't funny, of slowly, methodically learning how to make herself smaller so that he would not have reason to notice her. 4 years of telling herself that this was love, just a different vocabulary of it than she had expected. "Graham." She heard her own voice change, not louder, lower, a frequency she didn't use often. "Whatever you think happened, you do not have the right to put me out of this house in the middle of January without... I have every right." He was still holding the coat out. "This is my house. You signed a prenuptial agreement. You own nothing in it." "I am your wife." "Were," he said. "The paperwork will be filed in the morning." She looked at the coat in his outstretched hand. The thing that struck her, the thing that would stay with her later in the way that small details stay when everything around them has gone blurry, was that he was not angry. His jaw was not tight. His eyes were not hot. He had the expression of a man closing a business deal he had been thinking about for a while. A little tired, a little relieved, already mentally moving on to the next item. She crossed the room and took the coat from his hand. She would not give him the image of her refusing it. She would not stand there in her cashmere sweater and let him watch her bargain. "My things," she said, "will be packed and delivered to wherever you indicate in the next 48 hours. He stepped back, creating space, as if her proximity was already an inconvenience. "Tonight you leave with what you can carry. My purse is upstairs. Take it." She moved past him and out into the hallway, and she climbed the stairs with a deliberate evenness, one foot, then the other, the kind of walking that takes everything you have when your legs want to give. The bedroom was cold. She hadn't noticed that before, but it was always cold, this room, a cold that came from the walls themselves and had nothing to do with the thermostat. She took her purse. Inside it, her phone, a lipstick, $40 in cash, her driver's license. She looked at herself in the mirror above the dresser and stood there for a moment with a face that did not look like her face. Or maybe it was exactly her face, and she was only now seeing it clearly, stripped of the 4-year performance of being Graham Whitmore's wife. She was 43 years old. Her hair was dark, pulled back at the neck. She had what her mother had called good bones, the kind of face that didn't age so much as settle. She looked, she thought, like a woman who had been somewhere difficult and had not yet decided whether the journey had been worth it. She went back downstairs. Graham was waiting in the foyer. He had opened the front door. The cold came in immediately, an immediate brutal presence, the kind of cold that announces itself as a physical object and not merely a temperature. The wind moved through the door frame and lifted the edge of her coat, and she buttoned it with fingers that were already stiffening. On the front step, the snow was coming down so thick it was nearly impossible to see the end of the driveway. "Graham," she said, one more time, standing at the threshold with the last of whatever it was. Dignity, habit, hope, she wasn't certain which. "If you do this, there is no coming back from it." He looked at her with those calculating eyes, and what she saw in them was not doubt.
was not anything that resembled the man she had decided to love all those years ago. The man who had brought her coffee the morning after their first night together and sat on the edge of the bed and told her about his father in a voice he'd never used in public, a young man's voice, a cracked open voice, and she had thought then that she was seeing the real one. Maybe she had been wrong. Maybe the real one had always been this: the coat, the open door, the January night. "Goodbye, Vanessa," he said, and he closed the door. She stood on the front step as the latch clicked into place and the light from inside disappeared from under the door, and the snow came down around her in merciless silence. She walked. There was nothing else to do. She walked down the driveway and through the iron gate that Graham had always been so proud of, custom-made, 12 feet high, a statement of permanence, and out onto the street, and the wind hit her like a fist. This was not the romantic kind of cold that novelists wrote about. This was a physical hostility. This was Chicago January, Lake Michigan wind, 17 degrees Fahrenheit, before the chill factor, and she was wearing a camel hair coat that belonged in October, and shoes with a heel that was not designed for ice. The neighborhood was silent. This was the kind of neighborhood where silence was expensive, where the houses were set back from the street and the lots were wide, and if a person was in distress on the sidewalk, the most they could hope for was that someone might call it in from a warm interior rather than come out to help. She had chosen this neighborhood with Graham, had called it beautiful, had meant it, she supposed, in the way you could mean something and be completely wrong about why. She turned north because the wind was marginally less savage from that direction. Her phone was in her purse, and she pulled it out with fingers that fumbled, the screen shocking with its brightness against the white dark of the storm. She would call someone. She tried to think of who. Her friends in Chicago, Graham's friends' wives, she recognized now, had always been Graham's friends' wives, women who would take his call first and hers second, and maybe not at all once they understood which side of this divorce they wanted to be on. Her mother had been dead for 6 years. She scrolled past names she barely recognized and felt, with a clarity that was almost peaceful, the extent of what she had lost in those 4 years beyond the house and the comfort and the marriage itself. She had lost her own territory. She had trimmed herself so thoroughly to fit into Graham's life that she had let her own recede and thin and eventually disappear, and now she was standing in the snow on a street in Lincoln Park and couldn't think of a single person she could call who was only and simply hers. She had, as a matter of fact, one person. She almost didn't call him. There was something in her, pride, or the thing pride becomes when it's been beaten up enough, that resisted it. Damien had always been careful about Graham. Not hostile, not explicit, just careful in the way that people who love you are careful when they believe you are making a mistake and understand that telling you so will only push you further toward it. He had said once, in the 2nd year of the marriage, over Thanksgiving dinner at a restaurant because Graham didn't like to host, "You don't have to disappear into a person to love them, Valerie." She had used her new name then and told him he didn't understand, and they had not spoken about it again. She had not been Valerie to anyone in 4 years. Her thumb hovered over his name. She pressed it. It rang 3 times. 4. The cold was in her feet now, moving up through her heels and into her ankles, and the snow was accumulating on her shoulders, and she thought with a kind of distant practical clarity that this was what hypothermia felt like in the early stages. Not dramatic, not painful yet, just a slow dimming of sensation, the body rationing warmth to its interior. "Val." He picked up on the 5th ring, and his voice was thick with sleep, but immediately alert in the way that people from certain kinds of families are always alert, even half-conscious, to a call that comes at the wrong hour. "What's wrong?" Not a question. A statement. Because Damien Sterling, even 6 states away in his Manhattan penthouse, in the first syllable of hearing her breath in a snowstorm, already knew that something was fundamentally, structurally wrong. "I need you," she said. 2 words. The most honest 2 words she had said in 4 years. A pause. She heard him moving, the sound of sheets, the precise noise of a man already making decisions. "Where are you?" he said. She told him. "Are you inside?" "No." Another pause. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped into a register she recognized from childhood. the voice Damien used when someone had broken something that mattered to him, and he was choosing what to do about it before he chose to feel it. "Go to the corner of North Clark and Armitage," he said. "There's a hotel there, the Belden Stratford. Walk in, tell them you need a room under Sterling. I'll have my card on file in 5 minutes." "Damien, walk," he said. "Talk when you're inside." She walked. 4 blocks. 4 blocks in heeled shoes on an iced sidewalk in driving snow, and by the 3rd block her feet had gone entirely numb, and by the 4th she was holding the lapels of her coat closed with both hands, and her phone was tucked against her neck, and the only thing keeping her moving at a functional pace was the same thing that had always kept Valerie Sterling moving, a fundamental refusal to let a situation have the last word. Even now, even in this, something in her noted the absurdity with a kind of cold, dry humor, that Graham Whitmore thought he had destroyed a woman who did not have a floor beneath her, not understanding that the floor had always been there, had always been hers, built before he ever said her name. The hotel entrance appeared through the snow like a lit frame, glass doors, warm light inside. She pushed through, and the heat hit her face, and she stood in the lobby for a moment, letting her body process the change in temperature, dripping melted snow onto marble, her heels clicking faintly as she crossed to the desk. The young man behind the counter looked at her. The ruined coat, the snow in her hair, the particular expression of a woman who is holding herself together through mechanics rather than emotion. And to his credit, whatever he registered it professionally. "I need a room," she said. "Under Sterling." He typed. He found it. Damien had been as good as his word. She took the key card. The elevator was warm and mirrored, and she looked at herself in it and saw the damage. Lips gone pale, cheeks raw, mascara tracked below one eye, a woman who had been put out into a storm and had walked through it and arrived somewhere with the evidence of both things visible on her body. She looked at herself for the full duration of the elevator ride and did something deliberate with her face, something internal, some shift of ballast. She was choosing to be done with the version of herself that had let this happen for 4 years. Not out of anger, or not only out of anger, but out of a recognition as simple and cold and unequivocal as the night she had just walked through. She had built this prison herself, one small compromise at a time, and she was the only one who could dismantle it. The room was dark and warm. She sat on the edge of the bed and her phone rang. "Tell me what happened," Damien said. She told him. All of it. The study door, the Meridian deal, the server logs, Lydia Cross and her pulled reports and her careful patient waiting, the coat, the open door, the click of the latch. She told it without embellishment and without breaking, and when she was done there was silence from Damien's end that had a particular quality, a controlled silence, the kind that precedes something very deliberate. "Val," he said finally. "I know," she said. "It's time to come home." She looked at her hands in her lap, still cold. The warmth of the room hadn't reached them yet. She had been Vanessa Hartwell for 4 years and had been Valerie Sterling for 39 years before that, and she understood in this moment the full weight of the distance between those two names, the amount of self she had abandoned in the crossing. "I don't know if Sterling Fashion still wants—" "I'm the majority shareholder," Damien said, with a patience that had an edge of something else in it, something that sounded almost like controlled fury on her behalf. "And I'm also your brother. So I'm telling you both professionally and personally that whatever you need, whatever the company can give you, it's yours, tonight, tomorrow, permanently." She breathed. One long breath in and out. "I want it back," she said. And she did not mean the company. She meant the version of herself that had existed before she decided that love required her to be smaller than she actually was. She meant the instinct and the clarity and the appetite and the ambition that she had wrapped in cotton wool and set aside because Graham Whitmore needed to be the largest thing in every room. "I know," said Damien. "I'm going to sleep," she said. "I need to not be conscious for a few hours." "There's a car to O'Hare at 6 a.m., he said. "My driver. He knows to come to the Belden. Sleep." She lay back on the bed in her damp coat because the effort of removing it was more than she could currently manage, and she stared at the dark ceiling with her wet shoes still on her feet, and outside the window she could hear the city absorbing the storm, the occasional vehicle, the wind, the silence of all that white falling without permission onto everything. She was going to be all right. She had always been going to be all right. That was the thing Graham had never understood. The thing he could not have understood, because she had never shown him. She had shown him the quiet version, the accommodating version, the version that absorbed his moods and managed his ego and made herself navigable. He did not know about the other version, the one that had walked 4 blocks through a January blizzard and arrived somewhere intact and already calculating the distance to New York. She closed her eyes. In the morning, she would be on a plane. In the morning, she would be Valerie Sterling again. What she did not know yet, what she could not have known, lying in a hotel room in her soaked coat while the Chicago storm continued its work outside, was that 6 blocks away, in a house with custom iron gates and marble floors and a study with thick oak doors, Graham Whitmore was standing at his own window watching the snow come down, and that the phone call he had just received from Lydia Cross's personal line had gone unanswered, and that in the morning, when he went to his private server to review the logs she had shown him, he was going to find that certain files had been accessed by an account that did not belong to his wife at all. He was going to find that something had been done very carefully, very thoroughly, and by someone who had been inside his systems not for one afternoon but for months. He was going to stand in that study and understand with the full force of a man who has just dropped something irreplaceable and watched it shatter on marble, what he had actually done. But that was morning. Tonight, Vanessa slept. And somewhere in the city, in an office building that kept its lights on regardless of the hour, Lydia Cross sat at a desk that was technically her employer's and reviewed an email chain with the careful satisfaction of someone checking their work, and did not notice, yet, the single thread she had left exposed, one account, one file, one timestamp, that was 6 minutes too early to belong to the access she had manufactured, a hairline fracture in the architecture of her perfect lie that would, in time, split the whole thing open. The storm pressed against every window. The city went white and silent under it. And Vanessa Hartwell, who had once been Valerie Sterling and would be Valerie Sterling again before this winter ended, breathed in the dark. And for the first time in 4 years, she did not brace for the sound of footsteps approaching. The car arrived at 5:58 in the morning. Vanessa was already standing in the lobby when the black SUV pulled up to the Belden Stratford's entrance, her coat dried and rebuttoned, her hair pulled back with a precision that had cost her 20 minutes in front of a bathroom mirror and a level of focus that had nothing to do with vanity. She had slept 4 hours. They were the cleanest 4 hours she could remember in years. No listening for footsteps, no half-consciousness monitoring the temperature of the room for signs of Graham's mood. Just dark and silence, and the body doing what it needed to do. The driver was a compact man in his 50s who opened the rear door without speaking and closed it behind her with the kind of efficiency that told her Damien had briefed him. No small talk, no questions. Just the city sliding past the tinted windows as they moved through a Chicago that was still dark and white-covered and not yet awake. And Vanessa sat in the back with her purse in her lap and watched it go and felt something she would have struggled to name. Not grief, not relief, but something structural, like a joint that had been out of alignment for years finally settling back into its socket. Painful. Correct. She landed at JFK at 10:30. Damien was waiting at the gate. Not his driver. Damien himself, in a charcoal overcoat, 6 feet of older brother energy that she had once taken entirely for granted and now hit her somewhere unguarded. He was 51, her brother, and he had their father's jaw and their mother's eyes, and 4 years of restraint stored up behind his expression that she could read because she had grown up reading him. He looked at her for a moment. Then he opened his arms. She walked into them and stood there, and neither of them said anything for a count of several seconds that was long enough to be something. "You look like hell," he said into her hair. "I know. Good bones, though." He pulled back and looked at her face with the same calibrating attention he used in boardrooms, and whatever he found there made his jaw tighten briefly before he controlled it. "Let's go." In the car, Manhattan arriving around them in winter light, he handed her a coffee and let her drink half of it before he said, "How much do you want to know today?" "All of it," she said. "The company's been struggling," he said. "Revenue down 30% over the last 2 years. We lost the Marchetti licensing deal in October. The board is restless, and Fielding has been quietly floating restructure proposals that would dilute Sterling family control. He said it straight, no cushioning, which was how she had always needed information delivered, and he had always known it. We need a creative direction that isn't cautious. We need something that makes noise. Vanessa looked out the window at Fifth Avenue. A billboard above a scaffolded building showed a woman in a red coat walking into wind, face turned toward something off-frame. Some other company's campaign. She noted it the way she noted everything now, with a different kind of attention than she'd had 6 months ago, than she'd had 4 years ago. The attention of someone who had been living in someone else's country and had just remembered the coordinates of her own. "What's the current campaign structure?" she said. "Conservative, safe demographics. We've been chasing the Nordstrom customer instead of leading." "Pull it." He looked at her. "Whatever's in development, pull it. I want to see everything from the ground up." She turned from the window. "And I want a meeting with the creative team by Thursday." Damien's mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile. "You've been back in the city for 40 minutes. "I've been back in my head for about 6 hours, she said. "The city took 40 minutes. The head took longer." He said nothing for a moment, then, "The board will want to be introduced." "I know." Fielding specifically is going to push back. "I know that too." "Val." He said her name in a tone that wasn't warning so much as acknowledgement. "You've been out of this industry for 4 years. They're going to test you." She drank the rest of the coffee. "Good," she said. "I've been tested." The Sterling Fashion headquarters occupied 4 floors of a building on West 57th, and the lobby had the particular air of a company that had once been formidable and was currently holding its posture through muscle memory rather than genuine confidence. The receptionist recognized Damien, looked at Vanessa with the careful, neutral expression of someone who had been well-trained, and made a call within 30 seconds of their entry. By the time they reached the executive floor, 3 people were already waiting. Martin Fielding was the first thing she saw when the elevator opened. 60, broad, the kind of man who had learned to use his physical size as a professional instrument. He was standing with 2 others whose names she retrieved from Damien's pre-briefing. Clara Hess, Chief Marketing Officer, 45, sharp and territorial, and Owen Marsh, Head of Finance, who was looking at her with an expression she recognized as the particular calculation of a man deciding how seriously to take someone before they've opened their mouth. "Valerie Sterling," Fielding said. He did not offer his hand immediately. "It's been some time." 4 years, she said. She kept her coat on. An instinct, not a decision. "Martin, you haven't changed." "You have," he said, and it was not entirely a compliment. "People do." She looked at him steadily. "Is the conference room available?" A fraction of a pause, just long enough to be a test. "Of course," Fielding said. The conference room had floor-to-ceiling windows over Midtown and a long table that seated 20 and currently seated 5, and Vanessa sat at the end of it without asking and watched them arrange themselves with the attention of someone who reads seating choices as text. Fielding took the chair to her immediate left. Clara Hess sat across from him. Owen Marsh positioned himself mid-table, which told her he was not yet committed to a side. Damien sat at the far end with his coffee and said nothing, which was exactly right. "I want to talk about the Marchetti loss," Vanessa said. No preamble, no throat clearing. Fielding's expression shifted by about 2 degrees. "That was a difficult... I've read the post-mortem. I want to hear what's not in the post-mortem." Silence. Clara Hess glanced at Fielding with the speed of someone checking in before speaking, which told Vanessa something. "The license terms," Clara said finally, "were structured in a way that limited our creative flexibility. Marchetti wanted final approval on all campaign materials." "And we agreed to that initially," Vanessa said. "The original terms were different. They shifted during negotiation." "Who led the negotiation on our end?" Another pause. Smaller this time, but there. "That would have been Howard Chen. He's no longer with the company." "I know he's not." She looked at Fielding. "Who authorized the shifted terms?" Fielding's jaw moved. A small thing. A tightening. A brief reassertion of muscle. "It was a board-level decision," he said. made in the context of several competing priorities at the time. She let that sit in the air for 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, Owen Marsh picked up his pen, looked at it, set it back down. The unconscious gesture of a man recalibrating. "Clara," Vanessa said, "show me the current campaign." Clara opened a laptop. The campaign materialized on a wall screen, a series of images featuring women in well-lit, tastefully composed scenarios. A rooftop, a dinner party, a morning kitchen. Safe colors, beautiful people. Nothing that would offend anyone. Nothing that would move anyone either. Vanessa looked at it for a long moment. "It's technically accomplished," she said. "Thank you," Clara said, with the careful tone of someone sensing the shape of what follows. "It says nothing," Vanessa said. "It's a beautiful sentence with no subject." Fielding. "Our market research indicated—" "I'm not talking about market research." She leaned forward, both forearms on the table, and looked at the screen with the focus of someone who had spent 39 years inside this industry and 4 years starving for it. "I'm talking about what a woman feels when she looks at this. Right now, in this country, in this particular moment, what does she feel?" No one answered immediately. "Nothing," Vanessa said, answering her own question with a flatness that was not cruelty but precision. "She feels nothing because this campaign is talking to a woman it invented, not a woman who's actually out there." Fielding. "Our demographic data clearly shows—" "Martin." She turned to look at him directly for the first time since they sat down. "I'm going to stop you from finishing that sentence because I want to tell you what I'm going to do, and I need you to hear it clearly before you spend energy pushing back on something that's already decided." She did not raise her voice. The room was extremely quiet. "I'm reclaiming my seat on this board as majority shareholder. I'm taking point on creative direction. We are going to build a campaign that is the most disruptive thing this company has produced in 20 years. And I need to know, right now, today, whether you're going to work with that or against it." The silence in the room had a different quality than silence usually had. It was the silence of men recalculating. Fielding looked at her for a long moment with the expression of someone who has not been spoken to this way in some time and is determining whether to be offended by it or impressed. Then something in his face shifted. Not capitulation, but something more interesting, a reassessment, the slight reorientation of a man who has spent years underestimating a variable and is now updating his model. "What kind of campaign?" he said. Owen Marsh's pen was in his hand again. This time, he clicked it. Over the next 3 weeks, Vanessa rebuilt herself into the industry with the efficiency of someone who had not lost the knowledge, only the practice. She moved through sterling fashion's infrastructure like a woman relearning the geography of a house she had grown up in, quick, instinctive, occasionally surprised by what had been rearranged in her absence, but never lost. The creative brief she wrote took her 2 days and 3 nights, and a quantity of black coffee that alarmed Damien when he came in on the second morning and found her at the long work table in her new office with printouts spread across every surface and a focused expression he recognized from childhood. From the version of his sister who had decided she wanted something and was going to take it apart until she understood how it worked. She called the campaign Reclaimed. The concept was specific and uncompromising. Women who had rebuilt from loss, from failure, from the particular devastation of being underestimated by people who were supposed to know their worth. Not inspirational in the soft focus, feel-good sense. Honest. The women in the campaign would be photographed in the actual circumstances of their reconstruction. A boardroom they had fought to enter, a business they had started with inadequate funding, an apartment they had moved into after a marriage collapsed. The sterling line would be what they were wearing when they decided to be done waiting for permission. When she presented it to the full creative team on Thursday, the room was quiet for a moment after she stopped talking. Then Clara Hess, who had been watching her with an expression that had moved steadily from territorial to something more complicated, said, "How fast can we move on this?" "Faster than comfortable," Vanessa said. "That's the point." Fielding was not in that meeting. He had sent his regrets by calendar notification at 8 that morning, which she noted and did not comment on, and filed in the part of her mind where she kept information she was not done with yet. 3 weeks became 5. The campaign went into production with a velocity that surprised the vendors they worked with. photographers booked on compressed timelines, talent selected not from the usual agency pools, but sourced by Vanessa herself from a network she had spent 4 years pretending she didn't have. The women she chose for the campaign were not all young and not all conventionally beautiful, and every single one of them had a story that lived in their face if you looked with the right kind of attention. She was looking with the right kind of attention. She had had 4 years of practice looking at surfaces and finding what was underneath them. Chicago was 6 weeks ago. She did not think about Graham Whitmore every day. She thought about him specifically and deliberately when she needed to remind herself of something. Not the pain of it, but the instruction in it. The thing it had taught her about what she was capable of tolerating and what she would never tolerate again. The night in the snow had been clarifying in the way that very cold things are clarifying. It had stripped everything non-essential away and left only the operative truth, which was that she had more architecture inside her than she had shown anyone in 4 years, and that the woman she had been in that marriage was a long-term visitor who had outstayed her visa. She was not that woman anymore. In the 6th week, the first campaign images went up in preliminary form on Sterling's internal review platform, and Clara forwarded her the response from the test focus group with a single line of text. They cried. 3 of them. Vanessa read it and set her phone face down on the desk and sat with the information for a moment before she called the production team and told them to accelerate the outdoor rollout. She was in a vendor meeting on a Tuesday afternoon, 4 weeks before the scheduled launch, when her phone buzzed with a number she did not recognize. She let it go to voicemail. She was in the middle of a sentence about Billboard placement in 3 cities, and she did not break the sentence. Later, when she listened to the voicemail, it was 12 seconds of dead air followed by a disconnection. She deleted it and went back to work. What she did not know, sitting in her rebuilt office on West 57th, with the city spread below her and the campaign taking shape around her, was that 6 blocks north, in the lobby of the Whitmore Group's New York satellite office, Graham Whitmore had just walked into a meeting with a potential investor who had paused in the middle of reviewing Graham's portfolio to look up at the television mounted in the corner of the waiting room. A news segment. A feature piece on the morning show. A woman in a tailored jacket behind a desk discussing a fashion campaign that was generating significant industry attention before it had even officially launched. The chyron at the bottom of the screen read, Valerie Sterling, CEO, Sterling Fashion, Industry Comeback of the Year. The investor had looked at Graham. Graham had looked at the screen. The woman on it, composed, direct, speaking with the easy precision of someone who had stopped being careful about what she said, was Vanessa. His Vanessa. The woman he had put out into a snowstorm in a camel hair coat with $40 in her purse because Lydia Cross had handed him a set of server logs and he had believed them without a single question. The investor said something Graham did not hear. Because standing there in a satellite office lobby, watching his ex-wife give a television interview about the global fashion campaign she was about to launch, Graham Whitmore understood, with the cold, complete finality of a man watching a floor open under him, that he had not known, not even slightly, who he had been married to. And the investor across from him was about to say something that would make that understanding significantly, catastrophically worse. The investor's name was Leonard Voss. He was 63, self-made, the kind of man who had turned regional manufacturing into a 9-figure portfolio through a combination of cold arithmetic and the patience of someone who understood that the right moment to act was rarely the obvious one. Graham had been courting him for 4 months. Voss had a reputation for taking his time, for sitting across from people and watching them talk, and then making decisions that bore no relationship to what he had appeared to be listening to. He was watching Graham now. Graham pulled his eyes from the television, from Vanessa's face on it, from the chyron that was still running at the bottom of the screen. Valerie Sterling, CEO, and looked at Voss and understood from the quality of Voss's attention that the older man had been watching him watch the screen and had drawn conclusions. "You know her," Voss said. Not a question. "We were married," Graham said. He kept his voice at the right register, the voice he used in rooms where the admission of any feeling was a liability. Voss was quiet for a moment. He looked at the television. The segment had moved on to something else, but he continued looking at the space where it had been. "Sterling Fashion," he said, "the reclaimed campaign. My daughter sent me the preview materials last week." He paused. she cried. Graham said nothing. I'm going to be direct with you, Graham. Voss set down the portfolio he had been holding. I had planned to tell you today that we were moving forward. The Meridian restructure interested me, and your track record on the East Side commercial developments is genuinely strong. He straightened the portfolio on the table in front of him with one deliberate motion. But I've been hearing things in the last 3 weeks that concern me. Structural things. About the internal management of the Whitmore Group. Graham felt the shift in the room the way you feel a barometric change. Not in any single thing, but in the aggregate of small signals, the air itself reorganizing around a different pressure. What kind of things, he said. Project authorization irregularities. Contract terms on the Meridian deal that were apparently modified without full board disclosure. Voss looked at him with the measured attention of a man who has made his money reading people under pressure. And something about a server breach that your own team apparently misattributed. The word misattributed hit Graham in the solar plexus and stayed there. Where did you hear that? Graham said. It doesn't matter where I heard it. Voss picked up the portfolio and placed it in his briefcase with the finality of a judge returning a document to a file. What matters is that I heard it from 2 independent sources in the same week. And in my experience, when 2 independent sources agree on something I haven't yet verified, the thing is usually true. He closed the briefcase. I think you have a problem inside your organization, Graham. I think it's been there for a while. And I'm not in the business of investing in organizations with unresolved internal problems. He stood. Graham stood because not standing was not a viable option. Get your house in order, Voss said, and the phrase sat in the air between them with a weight that went beyond the professional. Then call me. He left. Graham stood in the lobby of his own satellite office, with the sound of the door settling closed behind Leonard Voss, and looked at the television that was now showing a weather segment, and felt, moving through him with the slow, catastrophic momentum of a structural failure, the first true stirring of something he was not accustomed to feeling. Fear was the wrong word. It was more precise than fear. It was the sensation of a man who has been operating on a set of assumptions that have just been revealed to be wrong. Not slightly wrong, not wrong around the edges, but wrong in the foundation, wrong in the load-bearing parts, wrong in the way that makes everything built on top of them suddenly precarious. Lydia. He was already moving toward the elevator bank before he had consciously decided to move. He called her from the car. 6 rings. Voicemail. He called again. On the 3rd attempt, she picked up, and her voice had that particular careful quality that he now understood he had been hearing and misreading for years. Not efficiency, not professionalism, but the precision of someone managing what they revealed in real time. Graham, she said, I was in my office, he said. Now. A pause that was almost imperceptible. I'm in the middle of Lydia. He kept his voice very flat. My office. 30 minutes. He hung up. In the car moving north through Midtown, he did something he had not done in the 6 weeks since he had watched Vanessa walk out into the snow. He thought about her with specificity rather than with the dismissive blur he had been applying to the memory. He thought about the 14th, the day Lydia had shown him the server logs, the day she had sat across from him in that study with a tablet in her hand and a carefully arranged expression of reluctant duty on her face, and told him that Vanessa had accessed the private server between 2 and 4 in the afternoon. He thought about what Vanessa had said. I was in Evanston on the 14th, the Harmon Gallery opening. There are photographs. He had not looked for the photographs. He had not needed to look for photographs because Lydia had shown him timestamps and account credentials, and he had believed them the way powerful men believe things that confirm what they were already predisposed to feel, quickly, completely, without the friction of inquiry. He had been predisposed. He sat with that recognition in the back of a car moving through Manhattan traffic and let it expand into its full shape, which was ugly and specific and his. He had wanted a reason. Not consciously, not explicitly, but somewhere in the architecture of what he felt about his marriage. The low-grade dissatisfaction he had managed by converting it to judgment, the suspicion that Vanessa was something he had accepted without proper examination. He had wanted a reason that was her fault rather than a reckoning that was his, and Lydia had given him one. She arrived at the office 17 minutes after he did, which told him she had come directly from wherever she was rather than taking time to prepare, which in turn told him that something in his voice on the phone had communicated urgency she did not want to underestimate. She was composed when she walked in. Dark suit, hair in its usual order, the face she maintained as a professional instrument. But her eyes did a rapid inventory of the room when she entered, a quick sweep of him, of the desk, of what was on it, that he now saw for what it was. Assessment. She was assessing the situation before she had said a word. How long had she been doing that? "Sit down," he said. She sat. She set her portfolio on the table and folded her hands on top of it with a stillness that he now understood was not composure, but performance. He had an assistant who performed composure. He had employed her for 6 years and had read the performance as the real thing. "Walk me through the 14th again," he said. Her expression did not change by any dramatic degree, a slight recalibration behind the eyes. "The server logs from January 14th. Yes? I reviewed them the morning after Cartwright called. The access was clearly documented. What account? V. Hartwell, which was the account your IT department assigned when... Who requested that account?" A pause, smaller than the one she'd been allowing herself. "IT handles account provisioning based on Lydia." He leaned forward. "I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to understand that I have already spoken with 2 people this morning who have given me information that I am currently cross-referencing in real time. So the value of accuracy right now significantly exceeds whatever value you might currently be assigning to a different strategy." The room was very quiet. Through the windows, Midtown moved in its usual dense indifference. Lydia looked at him, and something in her face, not much, not dramatically, but something specific in the area around her eyes, shifted. It was the shift of a person who has run a calculation and arrived at a result they had been hoping to avoid. "The account was set up under her name," she said, "but the credentials were mine to manage as her onboarding contact in the early months of your marriage. So you had access to the account." "Technically, yes, during the initial period. Did you use it on the 14th? The silence was different from the previous silences. Previous silences had been tactical. This one was structural. This was the silence of something that had been holding weight for a long time and was now, in this room, beginning to give. "Graham, did you access the private server on January 14th using Vanessa's account credentials?" Lydia looked at her folded hands on the portfolio. 1 second. 2. And then she looked up, and the thing that happened in her face in that moment was more revealing than anything she could have said. Not guilt, or not primarily guilt, but something colder. Something that had its own internal logic. The expression of a person who has been operating on a separate set of priorities for so long that exposure feels less like shame and more like an inconvenience. "The company needed clarity of direction," she said. "You were distracted. You had been distracted for months by a woman who was never suited to the position she occupied in your life or your organization. The Cartwright deal was a genuine opportunity, and it required your full attention. I made a judgment call." Graham looked at her. He had spoken to thousands of people across the table in his professional life. He had negotiated with men who lied with genuine fluency, who could maintain eye contact through the kind of falsehood that would have made other people sweat. He had believed he was good at reading people. He had believed this about himself as a core competency. "You manufactured evidence," he said, saying it flat. "I presented information in a framing that was strategically useful. You destroyed my marriage." "Your marriage," Lydia said, and something finally cracked the performance, not into guilt, but into a conviction that had clearly been living behind the professional face for years, was already destroying your focus, your decisions, and your standing in this industry. "I watched it for 3 years. I watched you make accommodations for a woman who made you smaller, who made you second-guess yourself, who was..." She stopped. Reset. "I made a decision that I believed was in the best interest of the company." He stood up, not because he needed the height, though he had it, but because the body needed to do something with what was moving through it, and standing was the thing that would not result in criminal charges. "Get your things," he said. "Graham, collect what is yours and leave this building,
Security will assist if necessary. For the first time, she looked something close to afraid. If you terminate me under these circumstances, you committed fraud, he said, inside my company, against my wife, against a business partner. I am terminating you because you are a liability and a criminal, and because standing in the same room as you for one more minute requires a self-control I do not currently have. Lydia stood. She picked up her portfolio, and she looked at him with an expression he would think about later. Not remorse, not fear, but the expression of someone who had played a long game and was watching it close in an outcome she had not fully modeled. The board will want explanations, she said at the door, about the Meridian terms, about the authorization irregularities. There are things I managed on your behalf, Graham, that you are going to have a very difficult time explaining without me in the room. She left. He stood at the window and looked at the city below him and understood with a lucidity that was almost physical in its clarity that she was right. She had been inside his operation for 6 years, and she had not been merely managing from within it. She had been weaving herself into it, making herself necessary in the places where necessity was most valuable, threading her access and her knowledge through the load-bearing decisions in ways that would not be visible until you tried to remove her. She had built a position that looked like loyalty and functioned like leverage. He called his attorney. The attorney picked up on the second ring, and Graham told him, in 12 sentences, what had happened. The attorney was quiet for a moment and then said something that confirmed what Graham already suspected, which was that the criminal fraud exposure was real, but the process of establishing it would take time and resources, and would, in the meantime, require disclosures that would make the board meeting currently scheduled for the following Thursday a significantly different event than Graham had been planning. He ended the call. He looked at his phone. There was a number he needed to call. Not his attorney, not Damian Sterling. Vanessa herself, whose number he still had and who he had a right to call, under no definition of right that she would recognize or accept. She was on a television screen in a Manhattan lobby, building a company that was apparently about to be more significant than his, and he had put her out into a snowstorm in January based on falsified evidence and 4 years of choosing to be disappointed in her instead of curious about her. He did not make the call. He did not have the right to it, and he knew it. What he did instead was pull up the Sterling Fashion website for the first time since the lobby television, and he found the reclaimed campaign preview materials that had apparently been circulating in industry circles for 2 weeks, and he looked at them. The images were not what he expected. He had expected fashion. He found something else. Photographs of women in the specific geography of their own reconstruction, the precise texture of a life being rebuilt from its own materials. The woman photographed behind the desk of a startup she had founded with savings she'd hidden from a controlling husband. The woman standing in the door of an apartment that was small and hers and lit by morning light coming through a window she had chosen herself. The woman at a mirror, looking at her own face with an expression that was not vanity but inventory. A woman counting her own resources. He looked at those photographs for a long time, and then he read the quote that ran beneath them in the campaign materials. A single sentence, no attribution. The woman you overlooked is not the woman you remember. He set the phone down on his desk, face up. The board meeting was in 6 days. Voss was withdrawn. Lydia was gone and had taken with her the institutional knowledge of decisions that Graham had delegated and not examined and now owned entirely. The Meridian collapse was already generating questions from 3 other investors who had been watching the deal as a signal. And somewhere in a building on West 57th, a woman he had spent 4 years underestimating was about to show an entire industry exactly what she was made of. There was a knock at his office door. His head of operations, Carl Brannigan, entered with the expression of someone who has collected bad news into a manageable bundle and is now delivering it. The Hartfield Group called, Carl said. They're reviewing their position in the East Side development. Graham looked at him. And the board, Carl continued, has requested an emergency session. Fielding's office sent the formal request 20 minutes ago. He paused. They're invoking the governance clause, Graham. They want a full accounting of executive decisions on Meridian. Graham looked at his desk, at his phone, at the city through the window, indifferent and enormous. He had built the Whitmore Group over 22 years.
had taken a regional firm and scaled it through a combination of instinct and aggression and the absolute certainty that he understood the territory better than anyone in the room. He had been right often enough that the certainty had calcified into something he no longer examined, a load-bearing belief in his own judgment that he had never once thought to test. Lydia had known that. She had built her entire strategy on it. The emergency board session was in 6 days. He had 6 days to construct an accounting of decisions that had been managed, manipulated, and obscured by a woman who had just walked out of the building, and he had to do it without the person who knew where every body was buried. He thought about Vanessa in the lobby of that hotel. Wet coat, $40. The sound the latch made when he closed the door. He thought about what she had said on the threshold. If you do this, there is no coming back from it. She had been right about that too. He was only now understanding how specifically, how completely, how permanently right she had been. Because what was coming in 6 days was not a board meeting. It was a reckoning. And Graham Whitmore, who had spent 22 years being the one who held that word over other people, was about to discover what it felt like to sit on the other side of it. The 6 days moved the way time moves when the structure holding everything up has been quietly rotting for years, and you have only just noticed the smell, faster than you want, slower than you can stand, every hour carrying the specific weight of things you cannot yet control. Graham did not sleep on the first night after Lydia walked out. He sat in his study. Not the one in Chicago. That house was already in the hands of a listing agent, a decision made in the first week of the new year with the brisk efficiency of a man converting regret into liquidity. But the study in his Manhattan apartment, which was smaller and had no custom iron gate, and which he had chosen for its view of the park, a view that currently showed him nothing but a dark January sky that had not yet decided whether to snow again. He worked through the night with his attorney and 2 members of his internal audit team, pulling files and authorization records and board communications with the systematic focus of a man dismantling his own house to find what was inside the walls. What they found was not one thing. It was a pattern, small, careful, spanning 4 years of Lydia's tenure in the position she had made herself indispensable to. Contract modifications routed through her office for his signature during travel weeks, when he was least likely to read the fine print. Vendor relationships that generated secondary consulting fees that ran through an LLC that had no obvious connection to her name until you followed the ownership chain 3 layers in. Authorization requests for data access that bore his electronic signature on timestamps when he could, in several cases, verify he had been in different cities. She had not been sloppy. She had been patient and intelligent, and she had known his rhythms and his blind spots with the intimacy of someone who had spent 6 years studying them. He had handed her those blind spots, had prized efficiency over oversight, had delegated with the confidence of a man who trusted his own judgment about people, and had never once asked himself why a person as capable as Lydia Cross had stayed in a subordinate position for 6 years rather than building something of her own. She had been building something. It was inside his company, and she had walked out of this office on a Tuesday afternoon and left him holding it. By 4 a.m, his attorney, a careful man named Sutter, who had been practicing corporate law for 30 years and who had the bedside manner of a physician delivering serious diagnoses, looked up from his laptop and said, "We have enough to bring a criminal referral. The LLC structure alone is textbook fiduciary fraud." "How long?" Graham said. "To get her charged? Months minimum. To have it matter in front of your board on Thursday? It won't." Graham looked at the files spread across the desk. "What will matter on Thursday?" Sutter was quiet for a moment. He was not a man who cushioned information, and Graham had chosen him for exactly that quality. "Transparency," he said, "voluntary disclosure of the irregularities before the board enumerates them. A clean accounting of what was done under your authorization and what was done without it. And a plan." He paused. "The board isn't looking to remove you, Graham. Not yet. They're looking for a reason to stay. Give them a reason that doesn't require them to defend the indefensible." Graham picked up his coffee. It was cold. He drank it anyway. "And Meridian," he said. "Meridian is the most exposed. The terms modification happened on a document that has your signature. Whether Lydia facilitated it or not, explaining the unauthorized deviation from board-approved terms is going to be the hardest part of Thursday. Graham set down the cup. Set up a call with Cartwright for Wednesday morning. Sutter looked at him. Graham, I know, he said. Set it up anyway. He did not call Vanessa. The phone sat on the desk at 2 in the morning and at 3 and at 4, and each time he looked at it, the call he was not making became more specific and more impossible. There was no version of that conversation that was not an ambush, a man calling a woman he had put out in a snowstorm to tell her he had discovered she was innocent, because discovering her innocence had become professionally urgent. The timing made it grotesque. The sincerity of his remorse, which was genuine and which sat in his chest like something broken and not yet fully inventoried, did not change the optics. She was on a television screen. She was running a company. She was in the process of becoming, by every measure he understood, more formidable than he had given her any reason to believe he thought she was. He was the last person she needed to hear from right now. He turned back to the files. Thursday arrived the way bad days arrive. Overbright, too clear, a winter morning in Manhattan that was cold and pitiless and beautiful in the way that only entirely indifferent things are beautiful. Graham walked into the Whitmore Group headquarters at 7:45, 45 minutes before the board session, and the lobby felt different in a way that was entirely internal. Not the building, not the staff, not the marble and the elevators and the Whitmore name above the entrance, but his own relationship to the space, the coordinates of the man walking through it. He had been the apex of this place for 22 years, had built it room by room, deal by deal, with the accumulated force of his will and his instinct, and a risk tolerance that had occasionally alarmed his partners and consistently proven itself. He knew every floor. He knew the history of every significant deal that had moved through these corridors. He knew the way the light fell in the 20th floor conference room on winter mornings, and he knew it now as he walked in and took his seat at the head of the table, 14 board members arranged along either side, their faces doing the careful thing that faces do when the information in the room is serious and the decisions are not yet made. Martin Fielding was at the far end. He had the expression of a man who has been waiting for this moment for some time and is disciplined enough not to show satisfaction. Graham did not give him the opening bid. "I'm going to start," Graham said, before Fielding or anyone else could speak, "by telling you what I know. Not what I've been advised to disclose, not a managed version of events. What I actually know, as of this morning, about the state of this company and the decisions that have brought us to this table." He looked down the length of the room. "And then I'm going to tell you what I intend to do about it." He talked for 40 minutes. He did not use notes. He had spent 6 days living inside the information, and it was his now, all of it. The Meridian terms modification, the Lydia Cross fraud structure, the vendor relationships, the authorization irregularities, the specific places where his own delegatory habits had created vulnerabilities she had exploited. He named her by name, and he described what she had done with the precision of a man who has spent a week building a prosecutorial case and who has also, in the quiet hours of those 6 days, held himself accountable for the conditions that made the case possible. When he stopped talking, the room was quiet in the specific way that rooms are quiet when people are processing more than they expected to. Owen Marsh, the finance head, whose pen had been moving across a notepad for the entire 40 minutes, looked up. "The criminal referral," he said. "It's in process." "Filed yesterday afternoon," Graham said. "The Meridian exposure," said a woman named Patricia Eng, who represented the largest institutional shareholder after the Whitmore family stake. "The term's deviation. What's the actual liability?" "Manageable," Sutter said from his seat along the wall, where Graham had positioned him, "if disclosed voluntarily and contextualized accurately. The counterparty, Cartwright, has been briefed and is open to renegotiation under the original terms." "You spoke with Cartwright," Fielding said. It was the first thing he had said. His voice had a quality in it that Graham recognized, the voice of a man recalibrating, the voice of someone who had come to a meeting expecting one kind of fight and was finding a different one. "Wednesday morning," Graham said. 2 hours. A pause. "That's—" Fielding stopped, started again. "That is not the conversation I expected you to have had." "No," Graham said. "I don't imagine it is." The session ran for 3 hours. Not a flogging, Or not only a flogging, a surgery which was different. A board doing what boards were supposed to do, which was to apply systematic scrutiny to the management of a company's assets and come away with a plan that was better than what they had walked in with. Graham had been on enough boards in his life to know the difference between a session designed to remove someone and a session designed to rebuild something, and this, by the end of the second hour, had become the latter. He left the building at 1:30 with a set of conditions attached to a retained position, independent audit, restructured authorization protocols, a 90-day performance framework, and the specific feeling of a man who has survived something and is not yet certain what the survival means. He stood on the sidewalk outside his own building in the January cold and breathed. His phone buzzed. The number was Lydia's. He looked at it and felt something he had not expected to feel. Not anger, not the hot thing from 6 days ago, but a clean, cold clarity, the clarity of a man who has processed the worst of something and arrived at its actual dimensions. He declined the call. He was 3 blocks from his apartment when his phone buzzed again. Not Lydia. A number he recognized because he had never deleted it and had not called it in 6 weeks and had looked at it at 2 in the morning and at 3 and at 4 without making the call. He stopped walking. Vanessa was calling him. He stood on a Manhattan sidewalk with the phone in his hand and felt his own heartbeat in a way he rarely felt it. Not the elevated rate of stress or exertion, but something more specific, a physical signal from somewhere inside him that registered this moment as the kind that would matter regardless of what he did next. He answered, "Graham." Her voice was the same. That was the thing that hit him first, absurdly. That her voice was exactly the same, that same particular quality of a woman who chose her words deliberately and spoke them from a place behind whatever the surface was. "I know what happened with Lydia." He found his voice. "How?" Damien's attorney has been monitoring the corporate fraud filings for the last 3 weeks. My name was connected to the original case. We were notified when the referral was filed. A pause. Brief. Professional. "I'm not calling because I need anything from you. I want to be clear about that." "I know," he said. "I'm calling because there is a statement that my legal team is releasing tomorrow in connection with the fraud case that will address the falsified server logs and clear my name from the January incident. I wanted you to hear it from me before it goes public." He stood very still on the sidewalk. People moved around him. The city continued its enormous, unconcerned business. "Vanessa," he said. Her name. Just the name, without anything attached to it, because there was nothing he could attach to it that was adequate to what was required. "Don't," she said. Not harshly. With the finality of someone who has already traveled a great distance from the place where that conversation would have mattered. "I need to tell you, Graham." Her voice did not waver, did not heat up. It was the voice of a woman who had been put out in a snowstorm and had walked through it and had rebuilt something on the other side of it, and was now standing in a different country entirely, looking back at a border she had crossed. "Whatever you need to say it to your attorney. Say it to your board. Say it in the deposition when Lydia's case goes to trial." A breath. 1 beat. "I have work to do." The call ended. He stood on the sidewalk with the phone in his hand for a moment that stretched in the way that moments stretch when they are doing more than containing time, when they are containing the full weight of a particular understanding, the specific reckoning of a man who has just heard the voice of a woman he wronged speak to him from a height he did not know she occupied. She had work to do. She had a company and a campaign and a life she had rebuilt from the inside out while he had been dismantling his own. She had walked 4 blocks through a blizzard with $40 and the architecture of everything she had ever been, and she had built upward from it with a speed and a sureness that now, standing on a midtown sidewalk in January, he understood was not a surprise if you had ever really looked at her. He had not really looked at her. That was the thing he would carry. Not the board session, and not Lydia, and not the Meridian exposure, and not Voss's withdrawn interest. All of that was fixable. All of that was business. All of that was the kind of damage that 22 years of competence and a good attorney and some genuine reckoning could eventually address. The thing he would carry was simpler and worse. He had looked at Vanessa Hartwell for 4 years and had seen a woman who was not enough, had seen a surface and had not troubled himself to find the depth beneath it. had applied to her the same incurious certainty that he applied to everything he believed he already understood. She had shown him the quiet version, and he had decided the quiet version was the whole thing. He started walking. There was a board report to file and a restructuring plan to draft, and a call with Sutter at 4, and the beginning, however long and undignified, of putting back together what 6 years of misplaced trust and 4 days of catastrophic judgment had taken apart. He had work to do, too. What he did not know, what he would not know until the following morning, when the Sterling Fashion PR team released the Reclaim campaign's first national push in 7 major markets simultaneously, when the billboards went up in New York and Chicago and Los Angeles, and the magazine covers hit the stands, and the digital campaign launched across every platform, and Valerie Sterling's face was suddenly and comprehensively everywhere, was that this was only the beginning of understanding what he had thrown away. Tomorrow, he would walk out of his apartment and see her face on the side of a building, 30 feet tall, looking not at the camera, but at something in the distance beyond it, the expression of a woman who had already decided what she was going toward. Tomorrow, he would understand for the first time, with the full force of the irreversible, what it meant to have been the man who didn't look. But tonight, there was still the walk back, still the cold, and the city, and the sound of his own footsteps on pavement. And somewhere across Midtown, in a building on West 57th, the woman he had underestimated was not thinking about him at all. The billboards went up on a Wednesday. Vanessa was in a car moving through Midtown when Clara called to tell her the outdoor campaign had gone live, and she looked up from the window and saw her own face on the side of a building on 7th Avenue, 40 feet tall, looking not at the camera but at something in the distance, the expression of a woman who had already made her decision before the photograph was taken. The image was clean and direct and had none of the softness that the industry had been using to sell things to women for the last decade. That careful flattery that told a woman she was beautiful in a way that also told her she needed to try harder. This was different. This was a woman who had stopped asking for the assessment. She looked at it for the duration of one red light. Then the car moved, and she looked back at the folder in her lap. She had work to do. The campaign broke nationally on a Thursday morning, and by Friday afternoon, it had moved beyond the fashion industry entirely and into the larger conversation, the way that things move when they touch something that was already there, already felt, already waiting for a name. The reclaimed images were shared across platforms with a velocity that the Sterling marketing team tracked in real time and that exceeded every projection Clara had built. The women photographed in their specific geographies of reconstruction, the startup founder, the woman in her chosen apartment, the woman at her mirror, were named and interviewed in pieces that ran in publications that did not typically cover fashion at all. The campaign said something. That was the thing. After years of beautiful images that said nothing, these said something specific and true, and the audience found them the way audiences find things that speak to an experience they have been carrying without vocabulary for it. Damien came to her office on Friday evening when the building had mostly emptied, and stood at the window with his hands in his pockets and looked at the city below them and said, "Dad would have done something embarrassing right now. Cried, probably." "He cried at everything," Vanessa said. "He cried at the weather sometimes." She laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere unguarded, and it surprised her a little, the ease of it, the way it arrived without effort. She had been laughing more in the last 6 weeks than she had in 4 years, and she had only recently stopped noting it as a thing that required explanation. "The board wants to discuss the international expansion timeline," she said. "The board can wait until Monday." Damien turned from the window and looked at her with the attention he had given her since childhood, the particular quality of an older brother who has spent a lifetime being the first person in the room to understand what she needed. "How are you?" She considered the question, not the social version of it. She knew Damien well enough to know he was not asking the social version. He was asking the one underneath, the one that had been accumulating since January. "I'm good," she said, and meant it in the full sense, the actual sense, not the managed sense she had been using for 4 years when Graham asked, and she answered. "I'm genuinely good, Damien." He nodded, accepted it. That was the thing about Damien. He did not press what did not need pressing.
Lydia Cross's attorney contacted our legal team this morning, he said. She's seeking a deal. Apparently she wants to minimize the criminal exposure by cooperating with the civil fraud case. I know, Sutter called me. Graham Sutter. Yes. A pause. Damien looked at her. She looked back at him with the steady gaze of a woman who has already processed what she is about to say and is not asking for guidance, but giving information. He reached out directly, she said. Graham. Last week. I took the call. Damien was quiet. I told him what I needed to tell him, she said. About the statement. About Lydia. That was the conversation. She looked at the city outside the window. It was everything the conversation needed to be and nothing it didn't. Damien picked up his coat from the chair where he had draped it. Monday, he said. Monday, she agreed. He left. She stayed at her desk for another hour, not working, or not exactly working. Sitting in the specific quiet of a Friday evening in a building that had mostly emptied, with the city visible through the windows in its 10 million light configuration, and doing the thing she had been learning to do since January, which was to simply be in a moment without organizing it into something useful. She had spent 4 years filling silence with management, with the constant low-grade labor of maintaining an environment that would not provoke Graham's disappointment. Silence in that house had been a variable to control, not a place to rest in. This silence was hers. She was still learning to inhabit it without the instinct to manage it, and the learning felt on evenings like this one, like a muscle finally being allowed to do what it was built for. She thought about Graham once, deliberately, and then let the thought complete itself and move through and out. She did not hate him. She had examined that question with the same careful attention she brought to everything she did not want to get wrong, and the answer was consistently the same. Not hatred, not the appetite for his failure that she might have expected to find in herself, but something quieter and more complete. An understanding. The kind that comes not from forgiveness as an act, but from having traveled far enough from a thing to see its actual dimensions. The smallness of it, the human ordinariness of it, the way that cruelty is almost never as large as it feels when it is happening to you, and almost always traceable to something broken in the person delivering it, rather than something insufficient in the person receiving it. Graham Whitmore had looked at her for 4 years and had not seen her. That was a failure of imagination, and it had cost him everything it had cost him, and she was not responsible for the accounting of that cost. She had her own accounting to do. She turned off her desk lamp and gathered her things. The statement her legal team released the following Monday ran 4 paragraphs. It laid out, in specific and documented terms, the fact that the server access on January 14th had been executed using credentials held by Lydia Cross, not by Vanessa Hartwell, and that the evidence presented to Graham Whitmore on that date had been fabricated as part of a broader pattern of internal fraud currently under criminal investigation. It did not editorialize. It did not assign emotional weight to what had been done. It named the facts and provided the documentation and ended. The statement ran in 4 industry publications and was picked up by 2 general news outlets and was the first time Vanessa's personal situation in the Whitmore marriage had appeared in print. She read the coverage once, then she put the phone down and went back to the international expansion plan. 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in February, Graham Whitmore stood at the base of the Sterling Fashion headquarters building on West 57th and looked up at it for reasons he could not have explained if pressed. He had walked past it, was the truth. He had been in the neighborhood on a different errand entirely and had walked past it and had stopped. And now he was standing on the sidewalk in the February cold, looking up at a building he had no reason to be looking at. The lobby was visible through the glass entrance. People moved through it with the purposeful velocity of a company that knew where it was going. The Sterling name was in the building directory. He could see it from here. He had been doing better. Not fine. Not the word he would have used 4 months ago, when fine was a floor he lived on without noticing it. Better was more honest. The board had stayed. The Meridian restructure was moving. Cartwright had re-engaged under the original terms with a wariness that was reasonable and that Graham had not contested. Lydia Cross was 3 weeks into a cooperation agreement with the fraud investigators that was, according to Sutter, going to result in a plea arrangement and a significant restitution order and a criminal record.
The empire was still standing, reduced, restructured, genuinely humbled in ways that he was still learning to carry, but standing. He had been doing the work, not the professional work, though that too, but the other kind. The slower, less measurable work of sitting with what he had done and what he had been and not converting it immediately into action. The way he had always converted everything uncomfortable into action, but simply holding it, looking at it, letting it be the size it actually was. The size it actually was turned out to be large. He had been a man who looked at surfaces and called the looking thorough, who had taken the quiet version of Vanessa and decided it was complete because he had never asked about the depth beneath it, who had weaponized his certainty against a woman who had loved him in the honest, patient way that people love when they are hoping the person they chose will eventually rise to the occasion. She had waited 4 years for him to rise to the occasion. He had given her January. He was not going to walk into that building. He understood that with a clarity that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with respect, the kind of respect that comes late, that arrives after the damage and is more genuine for it, because it is not contaminated by want. She had told him on the phone that whatever he needed to say should go to his attorney, to his board, to the deposition. She had not left him any ambiguity about the geography of the space between them. He honored it. He stood on the sidewalk for another minute, and then he started walking south. And as he walked, he did something he had been doing incrementally for weeks. He let the version of himself that had put a woman out in a snowstorm become exactly the size it needed to be in the story he was telling himself about his own life. Not smaller, the way ego wants to make its failures small. Not larger, the way guilt wants to make its failures infinite. The actual size. A man who had done a serious wrong from a combination of arrogance and blindness and the particular cowardice of someone who converts feeling into judgment to avoid having to feel it. A man who was going to carry that and not drop it and not convert it into something more manageable. He walked. The morning Vanessa announced the Sterling Foundation was the last Thursday in February. Not the fashion company, the foundation. A separate entity, capitalized through her personal stake in Sterling Fashion and through a fundraising round that had closed in 10 days with contributions from 47 individual donors, most of them women in business, and a handful of men who understood what the money was for. The foundation's stated purpose was support for women rebuilding from economic and personal hardship, funding, mentorship, legal resources, the specific infrastructure that the official systems did not provide, and that left women standing on sidewalks in January with $40 and no coordinates. She announced it at a press conference in the Sterling Building's conference room, which had full-length windows and February light coming through them at an angle that made the room look like something a cinematographer had arranged. She stood at a podium that was not the large formal kind, but a small one, a working one, and she spoke without notes in a voice that was even and direct and carried the particular authority of someone who is not performing anything. This foundation, she said, exists because I was someone who needed it and did not have it. That's the entire origin story. We're not going to make it more complicated than that. A reporter asked about her personal experience. I walked out of a difficult situation in January with very little, she said. What I had that many women don't have was a brother who answered the phone and a family name that opened a door. The foundation is trying to be the thing I had for women who don't have it. Another question, had she been in contact with her former husband? She looked at the reporter with the steady gaze of a woman who has decided what is hers to speak about publicly and what is not. That's not what we're here to talk about today, she said, and moved to the next question without heat or hesitation, the way you move past something that no longer has the power to unsettle you. Damien, standing at the back of the room, watched her and felt the specific pride of a person watching someone they love be exactly who they are. Clara Hess, standing next to him, said quietly, "She's going to be very hard to keep up with." "She always was," Damien said. "We just didn't know it." 6 weeks after the foundation announcement, on a morning in early April, when New York had finally committed to something resembling spring, Vanessa was at her desk at 7 in the morning. Not because she had to be, but because she wanted to be, because the work was the kind she had chosen, and returning to it each morning felt like returning to something that was genuinely hers, when her assistant knocked and came in with coffee and the day's schedule and a message that had come through the foundation's public inquiry line. The message was 2 sentences. It was from a woman in Memphis, Tennessee, She had seen the Reclaimed campaign on a billboard in her city. She had left her house the previous November with her children and $1,100 and had been rebuilding since. She wanted to know if the foundation could help her find an attorney for her custody case. Vanessa read it twice. She set it down and picked up her coffee and looked out the window at the April city, the trees along 57th beginning their tentative greening, the light at this hour having the particular quality of early spring. Not warm yet, but committed, the kind of light that has decided. She thought about a January night and a closed door and the sound of a latch clicking into place. She thought about 4 blocks in heeled shoes on iced sidewalks. She thought about the hotel room and Damien's voice on the phone and the specific sensation of lying on a bed in a wet coat and deciding to be done with one version of herself. She thought about all of it for exactly as long as it took her to drink half her coffee. Then she picked up her pen and wrote across the top of the message, "Priority. Get her our legal coordinator today." She set the pen down. She had a board meeting at 9 and an international expansion call at 11 and a foundation intake review at 2. And outside her window, the city was coming into its spring with the indifferent forward momentum of a place that does not wait for anyone to finish grieving before it asks them to participate again. She did not need it to wait. She was already moving. On the south face of the Sterling building, visible from the street, the Reclaimed campaign's final image had been installed the previous week. The one they had chosen last. The one Clara had flagged in the final review as the image that contained everything the others were reaching for. It was a woman standing in a doorway, not entering and not leaving, standing in the threshold, looking out. Her face had the expression of someone who has already decided but has paused for a moment to take the measure of where she has been before she steps into where she is going. Beneath it, in the clean sans serif that had become the campaign's signature, "Your worth is not decided by the people who walk away from you." The spring light hit the image at 7:15 and made the woman in the doorway look, from the street below, like she was standing in something warm. A woman walking past on her way to the subway stopped and looked up at it. She stood there for a moment with her bag on her shoulder and the morning moving around her. Then she took a photograph of it with her phone and kept walking. Inside the building, on the 4th floor, Valerie Sterling opened the next message in the foundation queue. She was already reading before the city had fully woken up, and she did not notice the light, and she did not notice the quiet, and she did not notice the absence of the low-grade vigilance that had lived in her chest for 4 years like a stone she had stopped registering as weight. She only noticed, distantly, in the way you notice the weather when it has been good for long enough to seem ordinary, that the morning felt exactly like what it was. Hers,